I do these sort of maps every year on trends, and this one I'm doing the next year is for this 210 is on trends plus technology timeline. I did an update about 6-9 months ago, and that I just thought, because I'm talking about the art of futurism, this would sort of fit quite well. We've actually got Dubai down here, so that was a good call. Okay, now this word futurist, I didn't pick being a futurist when I was 16 or anything. In fact, I didn't use the word at all until my book came out, and I wanted to call it History of the Next 50 Years, and the publisher wanted to call it Future Files. So it's Future Files, A History of the Next 50 Years. And then I'm instantly a futurist. And for 6 months, this made me squirm. I just thought, I do not want to be called a futurist. These are lunatics that think the aliens have been here forever, and I just don't particularly... And also, it's not correct, actually. It's futurologist, not futurist, although everyone shortens it because they've got no time. These are proper futurists, unlike myself. These are, as has been pointed out by Mark, these are sort of artists and sculptors from the early 1900s, the real deal. Looking quite smart, actually. All men, bit of facial hair. More men. These are futurologists. Lots of men, lots of facial hair, lots of glasses. No women. Not sure why. This is Nostradamus, by the way, and this is somebody trying to look like Nostradamus. So I've got the glasses. I haven't really got the other bits right, but anyway. When I do this sort of thing, I tend to get two types of question. One is, what the heck is a futurist? You know, brackets, why don't you get a proper job? And the second one is, you know, can you predict the future? Well, in terms of what I do, I think about the future. I just happen to do it virtually all of the time. I mean, we all do it. And I can sometimes think, I mean, I have quite a lot of time thinking 12, 18 months out. Sometimes it's 5 years, 10 years. In fact, most of the time it's 5, 10 years. Occasionally, people let me go mad and it's 30 years, and left to my own devices, I might go 50 or more. Can you predict the future? No, you can't. That'd be ridiculous. You know, that's a psychic, you know. Not in the sense of predicting individual events with any accuracy whatsoever. Having said that, the what's actually quite easy sometimes if you stare at things long enough. I mean, just if you know, you can just tell where things are going to go with some level of accuracy. It's the when that's practically impossible. And the other thing is, I think, whilst you can't predict specific events, you can see broad patterns, the sort of shadows of the future, if you like. There's a quote I use, which is overused, but it's overused because it's a good quote from William Gibson, that the future is already here, it's just unevenly distributed. And what he's sort of talking about, I think, is the thought that change tends to start on the fringe, on the outside, and it moves into the middle. It's sort of the opposite of popping a stone into a pond, and the ripple's going outwards. This ripple's coming inwards. So, for example, if you want to look at the future of mobile phones, if you go to Seoul or Tokyo right now, to some extent you'll see it. You will see people reading 80,000 word novels on mobile phones. You will see people writing 80,000 word novels on mobile phones. There are people having surgery on their thumbs so they can text faster. Now, I'm not necessarily saying that that's all coming here. Some of it might, some of it may not, because a lot of it's sort of contextual. You know, in Japan in particular, people travel long distances. They've got very high speed connectivity. There's the manga comic, which has a cell format very similar to a cell phone, and so on. So there are some sort of differences, but I do think you can kind of see broad waves slightly. Now, just one more slide really on what futurologists do. I actually quite like the term that the futurists once had, which was futurographer, which is to do with sort of exploring the terrain. We tend to say it's not about prediction, but we're probably kidding ourselves, because particularly the media, the one thing they want above anything else is a prediction. Probably the crazier the better, and the general idea is you make one so far in the future that you can leg it and never get called on it, or you make it so vague that you could have, you know. What I think it's more about is having sort of very open conversations in some instances about the future possibilities, about some of the sort of obvious risks and less obvious risks, some of the opportunities, and a lot of the time, actually, particularly with what I do, it's about shining a light on now. And it's actually, this word future is a convenient excuse to let people do that, because people are so consumed with the now, the next sort of quarter, the next year. They don't really think 5, 10 years out and so on. And things like horizon scanning, but particularly scenario planning, is a very popular technique, and it's kind of the serious end of what I do. I mean, most of my stuff is really ridiculous and fluffy, but the scenario planning has some rigor to it. And scenario planning is essentially a form of long-term strategic planning that comes out of Shell in the 1960s and the US military in the 50s. And I'm going to talk a bit about that later on, because I think it's a nice way of looking at the future, because it actually acknowledges there's more than one possible future. Never trust a futurist that says this is what the future's like. rubbish. You know, the future is uncertain, therefore surely logically there is more than one future. And scenario planning is a way of sort of framing that. The other thing that I sort of jump up and down about quite a lot is that, you know, we're not victims of the future. We can actually change it. You know, if we collectively decide we want a certain type of future, we can, to a degree, get that. If we decide that we really shouldn't be reading on mobile phones or computers and it should be on paper within schools, we can actually achieve that. And part of the anxiety that's around at the moment, I think, is that we're just not sure where we're going. And if we could collectively decide where it is we want to go, or the majority could decide that, I think we'd all sort of relax a bit, quite frankly. By the way, this image here reminds me of another great book you should possibly check out, which is called Where's My Jetpack, which is about, you know, futurist predictions from the past. Now, I just want to talk very quickly about scenarios, and I'm going to come back to scenarios in the end. The thing about scenarios is what you tend to do with scenarios is you try and find two critical uncertainties and you play them off against each other to create these sort of future worlds. So here we have a very simple one, pessimism versus optimism, and a radical industry structure versus a conservative industry structure, one that hasn't changed much, one that's in huge flux. This was a set of scenarios I did with a few other people in 2005 for a bank. And there's one down here called Security First, which basically says the world is security fixated, relatively bad economic news, people can't afford luxuries, society is very pessimistic, high local unemployment, customers value thrift, focus and consolidation. So, you know, that's kind of happened. The interesting thing about this, though, back in 2005, we had a problem getting the bank to take that one seriously. They said that'll never happen. We've solved economic cycles, we've cured inflation, that will never ever happen. And, you know, this was a bit more on it. And it's basically come completely true. And again, it just seemed to me that if you looked at the level of debt, the network nature of risk, and you believed in economic cycles, it was going to go at one point. You just couldn't say when, and I just got a bit lucky on that, really. In the book, which incidentally, if you Google it, you'll find it very easily, and the first chapter is entirely online for a download if you want to have a look. There are 5 key ones, and there could actually be a 6th, which I would have as anxiety, which I think is probably going to play into the future. The environment's obviously in there, so we're going to sort of talk about that at length, if we got enough time to talk about it at length. The first one, demographics, which we kind of know about. Marine technologies is genetics, robotics, internet, nanotechnology. So this is your nice sci-fi one. The environment, obviously, in the broadest possible sense. Global connectivity is a sort of mixture of globalization, mobile phones, and the internet. And power shift eastwards, I'll explain, but that's kind of the power shift from the US and Western Europe down into Middle East, China, Asia, etc. The first one, demographics. Now, this actually does have some direct relevance to climate change. There are people out there that think there are too many people on the planet, and if we could just get rid of a few, we'd solve the problem, or at least we should stop having kids. That's the greenest thing to do. A condom is the greenest form of technology around, and we should start using them. Now, I personally think that's a load of rubbish, but I'm prepared to accept that that's somebody's point of view. You know, we've currently got, what, 6.4 billion people on the planet. It's going to hit about 9 billion in 2050, and then it falls off the side of a cliff, partly because of this quite rapidly declining fertility rate. We're having less kids, and this is the sort of visual here. We're sort of treating them with kid gloves a bit more. And this is what, with this sort of risk aversion that is embedded in things like climate change is in there. And I would argue, actually, we're sort of, there's too much cotton wool involved, quite frankly. Lots of people living on their own or as couples. I mean, the nuclear family isn't really the most common family form. In most countries, it's one person living alone, or it's 2. Yet most organisations haven't quite twigged that. Immigration, obviously, I haven't got time to go into these in huge amount of detail. The family itself is getting quite fragmented. I mean, if you can find a house with 4 people in it, you've probably got, at 6 o'clock, 4 people in 4 different rooms doing 4 different things on 4 different screens, quite frankly. Not necessarily a good thing. And I quite like this idea of the screenager rather than teenager. Anyone under 18 generally spends their life staring at a screen, and it has interesting consequences. If you read something on a screen, it's now being shown by all sorts of evidence, you absorb information very, very differently on a screen to on paper. They are fundamentally different. If you read a newspaper online versus on paper, totally different. Now, you can make judgments about which is better than the other, but they do seem to be different in very fundamental ways. Online, you tend to extract information incredibly quickly.